welcome to Austin to our many visitors. I'll apologize somewhat in advance. When we went around the room, it sounded like we may have something of a diverse audience, and so some of my presentation for those of you who have spent a lot of time in transportation may be a little more on the 101 level than what you'd prefer, but in the Q&A we can perhaps get into more details if anyone would like. I always like to start off with the obvious, I guess, and what are the challenges from the perspective of a state DOT that we're dealing with. And some of these are shared by all states. Some of them differ from state to state, whether it's a growing state or a static state or declining in population. In Texas, one of the most quoted statistics, I think, in the state is that we have 1,000 new people moving to the state every day. And so in Texas, we have increasing population and increasing vehicle miles traveled on our network. Now, as a nation, what we've seen is the vehicle miles traveled actually declining in recent years, but here in Texas, we're seeing more demand on our network. That, of course, helps to create congestion and gets the tension between providing mobility and then maintaining the investment that's been made over the previous several decades to us. And in some cases within Texas, a very diverse state, that mobility and maintenance also at times turns into a urban and rural discussion as to what the overall needs are within the state. Another challenge we face is due to our primary revenue source, or one of our primary revenue sources, the motor fuels tax, is the increased fuel efficiency of the fleet of vehicles in the nation and what that is doing and is projected to do to that primary revenue source as we go forward. In Texas, our state motor fuels tax rate is 20 cents per gallon. It was last changed in October of '91. According to our state's constitution, a nickel of that goes to education and 15 cents goes into our highway fund, which is the dominant funding source for TxDOT. Obviously, over the last 20 years, we've experienced inflation, and I have some charts that show what that's done to those revenue sources over time. And then the uncertainty, even with MAP 21, the passage of MAP 21 this past summer, there's still a high level of uncertainty with the federal program, which is really something new for the federal program. In the last 60 years, this is really an unusual circumstance for there to be this level of uncertainty with that federal program. Real quickly, just to look at TxDOT and what we do, I thought it'd be good to take a step back. This is our 2-year budget for fiscal 2012 and 13, just under $20 billion. And we start at noon on the clock and work our way around. One of the things and what I've learned over the years is each state handles their budgeting differently. And as we've seen, large-scale projects take 3, 4, 5 years sometimes to complete. In Texas, those large-scale projects will show up in 3, 4, 5 different annual budgets as we make those progress payments. So they'll show up in multiple budgets. And so this first red piece, just over $4 billion of this 2-year budget, that is those progress payments for projects that had started in 2011 or sooner, and we're just continuing, so it was nothing new. 1.7 billion was for debt service, again, and oftentimes making payments for projects that may have been delivered and open to traffic 3, 4, 5 years prior. The bottom part is maintaining the 80,000 plus miles of yellow stripe that we are responsible for in the state of Texas. And so one of the points is we've made it 2/3 around the pie, and we hadn't talked about any new projects yet. We're paying for what's already underway, repaying for borrowed money, and maintaining what we have. The two green slices represent new payments on new project starts. So these are not the total value of those projects that are going to be started, but the total value of payments during 12 and 13 for those new project starts. The lighter green is coming from borrowed money, and the darker green comes from our traditional funding source, vehicle registration fees and gas tax. Yellow, before we can get to this point, we have to design the projects, we have to acquire the right-of-way, and that's represented here in this yellow slice. And then we also do work with some of the transit providers in the state of Texas, the small urban and rural transit providers. Some general aviation and Gulf waterway activities are in the smaller slice. Our admin is a little slice here. And then this is a unique funding source created by one of our partnerships that's restricted to just the Dallas-Fort Worth area. So we've kind of sliced it out that way. So that's what we do with the money. And this is where the money comes from. That almost $20 billion, just over a third of it comes from bond proceeds, borrowed money, not a continuing funding source. It's a one-time source of funds, very beneficial, obviously, for the programs and mobility we're able to deliver from that, but it's not a long-term funding solution. And then I mentioned the last one I mentioned on the earlier page, some of the revenue we had received from our partnership programs, some of them public-public and some public-private partnerships. Some of the upfront payments is that small, well, relatively small piece, 1.1 billion there. And then, so a third of the budget is from quote-unquote one-time funding sources, if you will, bond programs or these upfront payments and partnership agreements. Another third comes from our federal reimbursements from federal highway, and the last third, again, from our somewhat traditional funding sources, gas tax, registration fees, and some smaller ones here that are dedicated revenue streams to some of our debt programs. So it pretty much breaks into a third of one-time funding sources, a third from the Federal Highway Administration, and then a third from our state revenue sources. And so as we move forward and talk about MAP 21, and everybody, or a lot of the discussion was on the certainty around MAP 21 that it provided to transportation departments going forward. And it is very helpful, but one thing many people are learning is that this authorization bill is the first step in a multi-step process at the federal level. And it is up here, and you don't need to know all these details. The whole point of this slide is there are multiple steps before a state can actually obligate those federal dollars and then receive them as reimbursement. And that MAP 21 represents that first step. We have an authorization by Congress, and that leads to annual distribution of apportionments. And if you're not familiar with apportionment and obligation authority at the federal highway, I won't attempt to explain it in 30 seconds. It could probably be a full day class by itself. But when I think of apportionments, I think of the old joke of, what do you mean I'm out of money? I still have checks in the checkbook. Well, it's kind of the same thing. Apportionment without the obligation authority is about as valuable as a check without any money in your checking account. It doesn't do anything for you. You need both of them together to actually get something accomplished. Well then, as we move forward, each year we get the apportionment that's distributed to the states, but in the federal budgeting process, we receive an obligation authority. How much money actually goes into that checking account that states can then write checks against? We've gotten the checks before, but now money and the obligation in the budget process is going in. Well, one of the questions that we're seeing and people are dealing with now is sequestration. If it happens, what impact will it have in this new stable funding environment that was just passed last summer? May not be as stable as some had hoped or thought. And then unlike many other federal programs that may distribute their money to the states in block grants, the federal highway, federal aviation, federal transit all work on a reimbursement basis. So we will initially fund the payment to the contractors, and then we send an invoice to FHWA and others and get reimbursed generally for 80% of those costs. So MAP 21, to dig into that a little bit more, the previous authorization bill for transportation was referred to as SafeTEALU, and it expired back in 2009. And again, because of some of the funding uncertainty, it was not immediately replaced with another long-term bill. The norm in the federal transportation world is for authorization bills to be 6 years long, and then replaced obviously with another 6-year bill. SafeTEALU was, I guess, a 5-year bill that got extended so much it ended up becoming close to an 8-year bill and got replaced with a 2-year bill. So we're not in our normal pattern. MAP 21 was signed into law this last summer, but again, it only goes through the end of 2014. And one of the things I've talked already a couple times about the unusual timing or unusual environment of the federal program. And in March of 2010, the federal program was actually shut down for 2 days. And so for those 2 days, if a state DOT sent in their invoice to get reimbursed, they weren't going to get that reimbursement. It was halted for a 2-day period. The other very unusual thing in the past few years is at the federal level, there's a federal gas tax, 18.4 cents a gallon, a diesel tax, 24.4. Those go into the Federal Highway Trust Fund, and it has a highway account and a mass transit account. And historically, from the 50s when that was first developed, that had been bringing in more money than what Congress was allocating out to the states. And that was done in an effort to help balance the overall federal budget. But the revenues were bringing in more than what Congress was allocating out. What happened during the term of SafeTEALU, and that led to part of the delay in the implementation of MAP 21, is that flipped 180 degrees. The projections that everybody had done in the early 2000s, early and mid 2000s, when SafeTEALU was passed, did not come true on a revenue level. But Congress chose to go ahead and continue to fund in the annual budget, to continue to fund at those levels, and they did that by transferring general fund money into the Federal Highway Trust Fund for the first time in its history. Through October of 2012, and just from 08 to 12 in a 4-year period, Congress transferred roughly $43 billion of general funds in the Federal Highway Trust Fund. And in MAP 21, there's scheduled to be another just over $12.5 billion of that transfer, and that last piece is where the sequestration question comes into place. If sequestration does actually happen and we go through, is that general fund transfer called into question? Would it be reduced, and by how much? So some of the significant things that happened in MAP 21, if you look at the funding, programs and consolidation, and then program reform. On the funding, Congress again chose to keep funding levels basically level from 2012 with some small growth for inflation. Again, they're doing that by committing to move general fund dollars over. This next one, you hear oftentimes that each state is guaranteed a 95% return on the money they put into the Highway Trust Fund. And again, for those of you who are familiar, you've heard this argument and discussion probably way too many times, but there are donor states and donee states. We're developing a national system, but each state has a tendency to look at their own contribution and their return. Some states have taxpayers who put in more into the Federal Aid Highway Trust Fund than what comes back to that state, and obviously you have others that are different. And so in the law, they've tried to guarantee a minimum return. In MAP 21, they moved it from roughly 92.5% up to 95%. But I've underlined the contributions here because I think in the perspective of most DOTs, that's fairly close to a meaningless number. You get 95% of the money you're putting into the Highway Trust Fund, ignoring the general fund transfers. And so there's no assignment to general fund transfers to various states when it moves over into the Highway Trust Fund. So you're guaranteed 95% return on 70% of the overall pie. So it doesn't really, no one really expects that to come into significant play. TIFIA, which I will talk about in a few additional slides, it's basically a subordinated loan program from USDOT to transportation providers across the country. It can be public entities, state DOTs, local toll providers, city, counties, and also private entities. But it serves a role, and I'll go through some examples where the capital markets may not be willing to and able to fully fund a project, and so there's a funding gap. TIFIA is able to step in, provide that funding, and normally on fairly favorable structuring terms that really helps the project to get delivered. And what has happened, historically that program was funded around $120 million each year at the federal level. Through MAP 21, that annual level for TIFIA in 2013 is $750 million, and then in 2014 it's $1 billion. And the way the program works, it's kind of like an insurance pool or a risk pool. However much money they have in that, they're generally able to offer loans 10 times that amount. So before they'd been able to do about 1.1 billion per year or 1.2 per year in loans, they're now up in the $7.5 to $10 billion range. Program consolidation, there were a number of different programs with different guidance and restrictions and eligibility requirements that Congress consolidated down into fewer programs, which from a DOT perspective is a very positive thing, providing more flexibility to deliver those most needed projects. On program reform, there's an introduction of performance and accountability through performance measures. And those particular measures will focus on the national go areas you see here: safety, condition of the infrastructure, system reliability, and some others. US DOT will establish those measures, but working with the state DOTs, MPOs, and others to come up with those. And then the DOTs and the MPOs, as they go through their short, mid, and long-range plans, they'll need to show how the projects in those plans help them to attain the goals in the various measures. And that's relatively something new in MAP 21. This is just an example of some of the different programs, with the previous programs being here under SafeTEALU and how they've been consolidated into the newer ones. Some that may get the most discussion because oftentimes it's been a very popular program with local citizens, local interest groups, is the Transportation Enhancement Program that has gone over the years for a number of things: hike and bike trails, transportation-related museums, refurbishment early in the program of different county courthouses and different things, is being grouped into, with some other programs, into one transportation alternatives program. So we talked about the uncertainty of federal funding. This is what we had talked about before. This vertical line is showing the end of MAP 21. The red line is the distributions going out to the states. The blue line is the revenue coming in. Obviously, there's a gap in this area, and through 2014, it'll be funded by this transfer of $55 billion. The issue and the concern is, as a state DOT, starting environmental process, starting advanced planning, starting design work, we're working on in projects that we're going to be awarding, opening the bids on for 2016, 2017, 2018. Well, what's the funding level? How much money are we going to have to be able to go out and contract? How many environmental studies do we need to have ready so we can award the projects? And it's almost a catch-22. If you do too many of them, you've spent some of your valuable resources, obviously money, to get projects ready that you're not going to have the money to build and construct. Conversely, if you don't do them, that obligation authority that states receive from federal highways is only good for 1 year. So if you don't get that project to the finish line by the end of that federal fiscal year, you lose the ability to obligate those funds. And so the big challenge on the planning side is, what should we be planning for? Because Congress has been, in every DOT is thankful for it, has been moving general fund money over, but there is not a long-term plan. That is only in place, as we talk here today, for less than 24 months into the future. The planning horizon on transportation projects is much greater than 24 months. And so that is a huge challenge for all DOTs and MPOs as they work on their mid and long range plans going forward. We talked earlier about revenue sources, and I said that for the last 20 years in Texas, the rate has stayed the same. This is our state fuel tax, so gasoline and diesel, that goes to our state highway fund. And I picked 93. This was the first full fiscal year that new rate was in effect. So if you just look at it, and we have this conversation quite frequently, okay, well, it started off at $1.5 billion, and in 2012 it was just over 2.25. Well, it's gone up more than 50% in the last 20 years. Yes, population's gone up, but 50% growth in a revenue stream's not too bad. Well, the reality is the purchasing power has declined. The indices for the highway cost index, the equivalent of consumer price index, but for the construction industry, has gone up more than 50% in those 20 years. So back in 93, we were able to buy $1.5 billion highway widgets with that revenue stream. In 2012, we were about just over $1 billion. It was actually less than it was 20 years ago, with an increased population, with increased demand on our network. Same thing, the other primary state revenue stream is our vehicle registration fee. It has actually gone up and doubled over the last 20 years. So the erosion of the purchasing power is not as bad. It's remained relatively flat over that 20 years. But again, the purchasing power is flat in an environment of increasing demands on the network overall. So what are states, Texas and other DOTs doing in the face of these challenges and moving forward? Well, other states have increased their taxes and fees, some through their legislatures, some through votes of the citizenry. They've increased those state gas tax rates or registration fees. Others have elected to borrow money to build the needed projects today. And there's different ways you can do that. You can take a dedicated revenue stream and say, we're going to borrow money and we're going to pay it back with state gas tax, or we're going to pay it back with state driver's license fees. You can say, well, I'm only going to charge the people that drive on the infrastructure that we build to pay back the money we borrowed a toll road. Some states have elected to do more toll roads. Others have elected to pledge the full faith and credit of their state. So not any 1 or 2 or 5 particular revenue streams, but all revenues of their state to pay back the bondholders. Another thing that's been happening over the last 5 to 10 years is different types of partnerships, be they public-private partnerships, which really in effect work to the private sector either fully financing or helping to finance the infrastructure for a toll road, then getting and it varies by jurisdiction, a 50-year lease up to a 99-year lease on that infrastructure, where they have the responsibility to operate and maintain it, but they also get ownership of all or a portion of the revenue generated off that facility for those 50 years. This is just quick So one of the things we've done in Texas is we have gone into some borrowing programs. We have one program that is currently authorized up to $6 billion, and it's the pledge, the revenue that goes back to it are those motor fuels, taxes, and registration fees we talked about earlier. So it's a dedicated revenue source. Same with the mobility fund. Here it's driver's license fees, vehicle inspection fees that are dedicated to it, and it currently has produced about $6.3 billion in bond proceeds. We have a network of toll roads here in the Austin area that we finance through issuing project revenue bonds. And then the most recent one, our legislature did decide up for $5 billion worth to pledge the full faith and credit of the state to deliver $5 billion in the needed infrastructure. This chart, while very busy, shows a number of the different tools that have been used by TxDOT and others in within Texas to help deliver needed projects. We talked about TIFIA earlier on the top of the slide. In TxDOT and some of our local toll entity providers across the state to date have received over $3 billion worth of loans, and you can almost think of it as kind of like borrowing money from mom and dad for your first car. Hopefully you're going to get a little friendlier terms or payback terms than you would if you went to a bank or you went to Wall Street. And so there are a number of projects here that without TIFIA, they really would not have been delivered or being under construction right now. Another tool that Congress established was private activity bonds, and while they've been around for wastewater and aviation since the 80s, it's really new for surface transportation. Just within the last 5 years, there was a $15 billion allocation by the US DOT Secretary. And what this does is it allows private entities through these public-private partnerships to issue bonds at tax-exempt rates when they're using those proceeds for public work projects. Lowers the cost of borrowing for the private entity and helps make some of these projects feasible when they might not have been in a taxable environment. Then we've entered into a number of public-private partnerships, and one of them I'll go through quickly that just opened last month. Some of you, it received some press over its speed limit, more so than the way it was financed as it opened up at 85 miles per hour. But it's a $1.3 billion road looking at the right-of-way and the engineering and the construction cost. And I mentioned a toll network around Austin that we financed back in 2002. This 41 miles, which is really from South Austin down to San Antonio, was a part of that original package back in 2002 that we were looking to finance. The math did not work. The cost of the project compared to the revenue that would be generated from the traffic didn't work. It was going to require more subsidy from the state to be put in initially to build that project, so it was shelved. Then come along 2007, 2008, we had a consortium from the private sector came to us and said, we will build that road and no cost to the state. So the first thing we did is we went back and said, well, what if we did it ourselves? What if we went to Wall Street and the traditional municipal world and did a toll road that way? We had the same cost, $1.3 billion. We had the same toll rate that they had. Our traffic and revenue engineers had a much different view of what traffic would be on that. And so for this $1.3 billion project, the models showed in the municipal world we could only borrow $700 million. So we were going to be $600 million short, and with all the various demands across the state, our commission could not pull $600 million and dedicate just to one project. So the offer from the private sector was, we'll give you $25 million up front on day one. We don't want a penny from you for the $1.3 billion to build it. We will build it all ourselves. And then for the next 50 years as we operate it, we'll give you, on a gross revenue basis, a nickel out of every dollar that we collect. And if we begin to collect more money than what we anticipated, that nickel will grow to a dime, will grow to 15 cents, could grow to 50 cents out of every dollar collected in different thresholds. We also have a program that globally it's kind of referred to as shadow tolling, but in Texas it's pass-through financing, where in our planning process oftentimes we get locals who are very upset or discouraged because a very important project to them has not scored well in a planning process or has not advanced as fast as they would have liked. This program allows the local entity to front the money to build the project, and then based upon the traffic volumes, we TxDOT pay them back after the road's been completed, generally over a 10 to 20 year period, but again, it allows the project to be delivered sooner. The other kind of the mirror image of that is the State Infrastructure Bank, where our commission and TxDOT operates a revolving loan program where funds can be loaned to cities, counties, local toll project entities for them to use that borrowed money to build the project, and they will pledge to pay us back either from project revenues or tax revenues over time. The most recent example of partnership, so I talked about State Highway 130 where it was public-private. We also entered into a partnership with one of our local toll project entities in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, the North Texas Tollway Authority. They had delivered a number of projects, and their existing legacy system was really at capacity. They didn't have the ability to add additional projects into that financial system, but there was a demand for at least two additional projects in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. Because of the borrowing cost and the at a triple B minus level credit rating, those projects were not financially feasible. What we did in effect, and legally it's not this way, so my general counsel would throw their shoe at me or something. In effect, we created a line of credit, if you will, that if 15 years from now, 20 years from now, 25 years from now, revenues don't come in as anticipated, NTTA can come to TxDOT and borrow money for earlier eligible expenses that they can then use to pay off the bondholders. Well, this project that had previously been triple B or triple B minus was now rated AA because of this helping hand from TxDOT. Now, one of the concerns and what all these bullets go over is, well, that sounds great from NTTA's perspective. Sounds great from TxDOT to deliver projects. Sounds great from that perspective as well. But what happens if and when that loan or line of credit gets called upon? These bullet points go through the design, how we've tried to mitigate against that. The plan, of course, is that it never gets called on. It provides the assistance, it provides the rating lift, and it never gets called on. So there's a lot of early warning systems. There's a lot of reserves that are built within that new financial system that was created that would be tapped into before a loan would be requested from the operating fund of TxDOT. And that's what all these various bullets go through. And I think, you know, looking at delivering the needed infrastructure, whether it's in Texas or anywhere, most drivers really don't care if it's the state DOT, the county government, a local multi-county jurisdictional partnership putting it together. They just want the road. And so these partnerships, public-public, local level, state level, federal level, seems to be more and more of a trend as we go forward, again, to deliver the needed infrastructure in the most efficient way possible as we move forward.